Before you deploy Purview sensitivity labels, you need to get this part right, and that's the architecture, it's the workshop, it's the initial design to get things right first time. And if you don't get this part right, your entire project could fail. You could end up with some kind of resume generating event, your family could suffer, you could suffer, all manner of bad things could happen. Anyway, Recap here. Evelina and I are going to deep dive into the architecture, the best practices, and a full comprehensive in-the-weeds setup of Purview sensitivity labels. Okay, Evelina, so where do we even start when it comes to designing sensitivity labels, right? Because I know in some tenants you sometimes see pre-configured labels. I know Microsoft will get their own guidance, but I also know that Purview is the kind of thing that requires tons and tons of specific nuance and insight into your... Every company's different, right? With regards to what labels they need. So how do we get started with this? Where's a good starting point for designing sensitivity labels?
Great question. So first of all, you, I suppose, need to know what types of data you've got within your organization and what do you really want to protect. And then you would go on and decide on what that label taxonomy would look like for your organization based on your organizational needs, right? A good starting point is to refer to the official Microsoft documentation, where they do actually have recommended labels, which I'm just going to show you now, and then we can go from there. You need to know what types of data you want to protect within your organization. If you look at this specific table, which you can find within the Secure by Default with Microsoft Purview section of Microsoft documentation, they do have a label taxonomy with descriptions and different settings that they are recommending that you set up for each individual label that you might have. So there's no one size fits all for all the different organizations, depending on the types of data that your organization would be dealing with, right? So it is always a good thing to look at that table and look whether these specific labels and the settings associated with them would be in line with what you've got in mind for your organization and your label taxonomy or your label hierarchy as well. So for some of the organization, depending on the industry that you could be within, this number of labels might not be enough, right? But it is a good foundation that will allow you to determine whether any additional labels are going to be needed based on specific requirements. Maybe you would benefit from additional labels that would be associated with different departments within your company, or maybe some of these labels are not going to be needed. But in general, this would be a good kind of starting point to be looking at these as well.
Okay, understood. And as a starting point, you got what you got there. You got public, you get general, confidential. What do these different things mean, and why do Microsoft recommend them as a starting point?
Good question. So obviously, when you work for an organization, sometimes you are still dealing with types of data that would be shared with the public sometimes, right? So there would be no kind of repercussions when that data is being shared with people outside of the organization, or when that data is being uploaded to different cloud services. So in that specific scenario, you would benefit from a label called public, right? Because it's not a kind of corporate type of a data. It's something that would be publicly available, let's say on your website, or this is the types of information that you might be sending to potential customers and stuff like that, right? So again, the name is self-explanatory, and it would fit 99% of different organizations that we would be dealing with as well. So then when it comes to the general label, so this could be for the types of business data. Isn't necessarily intended for public consumption, but this is the type of data that can be shared with external partners if something like that is required, right? So you might be asking, what is the difference between public and general, right? Well, with the public label, you wouldn't necessarily be setting up any additional privacy settings on the back of that label, right? Because it can be freely shared with anyone whatsoever. Whereas on the other hand, with the general one, you still want to make sure that, let's say, people cannot just share a link and share it with anyone when it comes to labeling content with that general label, right? So you do have some additional privacy settings on the back of that label, and that's how you would differentiate those two labels within your label taxonomy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, let me try and make sure I understand it correctly. Public, essentially we're saying no need to control this under any circumstances because, hey, it's public knowledge. General, we're saying when I apply the label, we won't encrypt it or anything. which makes it technically the same from an encryption point of view as public, but because we're using a different classifier, that gives me the ability to then use that label in different parts of the Purview stack if I deem necessary. So it's like we're distinguishing the metadata. So we get public metadata, general metadata, and I can maybe say, hey, well, sure, it's general, but over in DLP, we're going to apply a policy for general, or maybe insider risk or something like that. So while on paper they appear to technically achieve the same thing, what would you say? You're kind of future-proofing yourself with the general one? Is that the idea?
Correct. So it's a really good point that you raised as well. So applying or deploying a sensitivity label will not always apply encryption to your types of data, right? Because maybe that encryption is not necessary, and that encryption can actually break some stuff if it's not done properly as well, right? So with the public label, for example, you wouldn't necessarily have any data loss prevention on the back of that, or maybe none of the insider risk management policies. However, with the general one, you still want to make sure that, let's say, when it comes to protecting your containers, so containers being your Microsoft 365 groups, your SharePoint sites, and your Microsoft Teams, maybe on the back of that, for that defense in that mechanism, you want to layer data loss prevention measures on top of that as well, which would be really good in terms of people maybe sharing data labeled as general from within their OneDrive or from within the corporate SharePoint side as well. So you want to make sure that, yes, they can classify that. There won't be any encryption involved or the name that will come as part of that specific label. However, there would be additional security measures layered just on top of Microsoft information protection. Because when you look at the big picture of Microsoft Purview, your Microsoft information protection, specifically your sensitivity labels, this is always going to be the fundamental part of everything else that you will be setting up within that Microsoft Purview stack. So this is only your step one, where you decide on the label taxonomy. But apart from looking at Microsoft information protection, you will also be looking at data loss prevention, your data lifecycle management, insider risk management, and so on. So with Microsoft Purview, all of those products and features on their own, they might not be that powerful, but if you add them together, if you look at the defense in depth mechanism, that's where they all kind of become really, really powerful.
Okay, following you so far, that's all making sense. And then I guess, kind of leading the witness here, as we start to approach these confidential labels, that's when the encryption starts kicking in, or does it? What's the next step then for our labels?
Correct. So obviously when you look at just even the word confidential or something along the lines of top secret, right? You cannot help but think that there's some kind of an encryption or another security measure that would be layered on top of that. So you're right in thinking that when we go into that confidential space, this is where encryption will need to appear. With sensitivity labels, you can have your parent labels, which means that a parent label doesn't necessarily need to have a child label. But for most of the cases, when you do introduce a parent label, most of them would also come with child labels or sub-labels, as we call them as well. So in terms of having a confidential parent label, right? You set up a parent label, but the parent label itself is not really doing much. But you kind of need to have it within your hierarchy to know how to differentiate them and know under which specific label those child labels will come under, right? So in terms of having the confidential all employees label, this specific label would be encrypted, but it will fall under the parent label of just a label called confidential. Gotcha. So with the confidential all employees label, as the name says, you don't want that content to be leaving your organization, right? So this is supposed to be intended just for internal consumption, in which case you do need to introduce the encryption element to make sure that even if you accidentally share content labeled as confidential all employees, people outside of the organization will not be able to consume that content. So with the encryption, this will all be based on the level of permissions within your sensitivity labels and who those specific permissions will be applied to. So when you look at the different label permissions, you then need to determine who, for example, should be able to remove that label or change that label to something else. So it might be a good idea to have maybe a couple of people that will have the co-owner permissions, and then the rest of the organization, you could give them the co-author permissions or something similar.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to check in there, when you talk about co-owner and things like that, if I set a label, so I say all companies, confidential, all employees, does that mean I can't change the label myself? Would I then have to go to like the other guy who's got permissions, or how does that work?
So the person that would create a file or an email and then label that with whatever label, that person will always be the author or the owner of that content. So you, the person who actually created that file, you will always have that permission to remove the label from that file or from that email, or change that label to something else. But if it's not yourself that created that content, then it will be all based on the level of permission that you were given, and that level of permission will then determine whether you can actually have whether you actually have that ability to change that label or not.
Okay, cool, makes sense. Got it. So that covers all employees, and I'm looking down and I'm seeing specific people as well there.
The name.
Talk me through that one, because that's obviously, what would you say? That's a narrower scope, I guess?
Correct. So when we look at a scenario where, for example, you might have a pay review with one of your employees, or maybe you're sending someone a contract or whatever, right? And you want to make sure that that specific person that would be a recipient of your email, of your file, that they don't actually share that with any other person, right? They cannot forward that information. Maybe they cannot print it, right? But maybe you don't really have those specific permissions set up for those people that you might be communicating with from within the Purview Admin Center. So this is where the confidential specific people label might come in handy. So let's say you want to send me a very sensitive document, and you want to make sure that no one else apart from me can open and consume the content within that document, right? So in this case, rather than labeling your document or your email with confidential all employees, you would be better off selecting confidential specific people, because that confidential data can then only be shared with that trusted person, whether this is someone within the organization or outside of the organization as well. So this means that based on additional kind of permission settings that you might be setting up within that whole process when you try to share that information, you then get to determine whether, for example, they want to forward that information to someone else, whether they can print it, and whether they can do a bunch of other stuff within that file or an email or a meeting or a site or whatever.
Cool, understood, makes sense. So I'm trying to think back when I've done this in the past. That applies kind of on the fly, doesn't it? So if I'm sending an email to someone and I choose specific people, it's smart enough to know that the people I'm sending that email to is who I want to encrypt it against. Is that still the case?
Correct. So when it just comes to an email, once you put in the email address of the recipient that you want to share that sensitive information with, the email or Microsoft Purview in general is smart enough to be able to recognize that this is the intended recipient for it, and no one else outside of that, whoever will be on the recipients list, will be able to consume that content. However, if it's a document or some kind of a file, let's say an Office 365 file that you are willing to share with one specific person or maybe multiple specific people, then you would get a pop-up within Microsoft 365 application like your Word or your Excel, your PowerPoint, where you do need to specify who are you sending that to and whether they can print it, whether they can add additional people to it, whether they can forward that information to someone else.
Okay, right. That makes a lot of sense now. And we're reading ahead in this Microsoft recommended kind of baseline, and it's also got this one internal exception.
The name.
I don't quite understand that. Talk me through that. I've just been a little bit slow here, but what does that mean?
Sure. So this is derived from the idea of secure by default with Microsoft Purview, which is the initiative from the Microsoft engineering team, where their recommendation, which is kind of the latest recommendation that we've been given, is to make sure that most of the stuff is encrypted by default, and that, let's say, you auto-label your emails or your files to be maybe labeled as confidential all employees. So it means that by default, the content cannot be shared with people outside of the organization. So if you follow that idea, then you obviously need to train your end users how to manage the exceptions to that rule, right? So if by default, people outside of your organization cannot consume your content that you're trying to share with them, obviously you're going to have a need for exceptions. This specific label got created just for that reason. So you might be in a position where maybe you want to share a document with people outside of the organization, but everything is encrypted by default from the get-go based on the level of permissions that are then set up within the Purview admin center. So this specific label will kind of let you bypass some of the security measures so that you can actually share that information with people outside of your company and kind of share it freely, right, with them.
And so, I mean, when we talk about encryption by default, I'm slapping my face here because I've done sensitivity level projects in the past. Granted, it's been like a couple of years since I've done them at the coalface. And encryption breaks lots and lots of stuff insofar as third-party app compatibility, external recipients. I don't know, it's kind of high risk to just go and turn on encryption by default. But I want to make sure I understand you correctly as far as with this model of secure by default, that is something that customers can do, right? And say, well, actually, we're going to be encrypted by default sensitivity label of confidential and encrypt it, and then opt out as and when I needed, rather than when I used to do this stuff and it was kind of like, well, the default was actually unencrypted and you need to opt in. Now it's an opt out mode. And so I hear what you're saying, but that, I don't want to say that scares me. But it sounds quite high risk, right? So would you agree that that's high risk? I guess I don't know. I'm kind of struggling to wrap my mind around that a little bit.
I would definitely agree because, as you mentioned, when it comes to encryption, that then causes some of the potential compatibility issues, right? Because let's say not everyone would be using Microsoft 365. Maybe they are using Gmail. Maybe these are, sensitive information could be shared with personal email addresses. Maybe, let's say, like the likes of, I don't know, electricity provider or whatever. When you communicate with those people, most of those companies would be using the ticketing system or some kind of a CRM. That might not necessarily support Microsoft information protection, might not actually respect the encryption part of sensitivity labels. So you do need to think of those scenarios where the lack of a better word, but you cannot actually encrypt some of the content that would be shared with people outside of the organization, right? So again,
if I think in my head though, like, so you raise a great point as far as, if you said it's like a CRM system mailbox, it's just not going to understand it. But what I'm also thinking out loud about here is if I think about the way I design conditional access, we get this idea of the quote unquote persona. Could you have like sensitivity level personas where for, I don't know, maybe the finance team or the HR team or my executive team, that persona gets encrypted by default. But then if I've got a persona that deals with consumers and is always emailing Hotmail and Gmail and all that, they don't get it by default. Can you kind of mold sensitivity labels into that kind of architecture as well?
You can, for sure. And this is something that I would actually recommend that most of the organization do. Obviously, it will all depend on the level of your maturity when it comes to the implementation of Microsoft Purview. But 99% of cases, your organization will benefit from another maybe couple of labels, whether these are confidential or highly confidential, based on the department that your users would be within. So let's say your IT team, your HR, your payroll, maybe finance as a general one, right? So just because you have labels, your labels need to be published within label policies, right? So it's the combination of your labels, label permissions, and your label publishing policies that will then determine whether those people will have a default label that will automatically apply to the emails, to the documents that they are creating, whether they are forced to apply the label to the documents or whether everything will be auto-labeled for them. Obviously, it will all depend on the level of license that you've got as well, with that auto-label part reserved for Microsoft 365 E5 or the E5 compliance add-on as well. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to follow the same rules or the same policies. You can split that into different departments. You can, for example, publish maybe the the basic kind of labels to everyone within the organization. But on top of that, you can have additional policies where, for example, the HR team will get additional 1 or 2 labels just for them and that content. When the content contains something specific to their department, that will be then encrypted by default or automatically for them.
Okay, cool. Right. That's making sense so far. And if I'm looking at what you're sharing on the screen just now as well, I can read ahead and I can see we're jumping now from confidential to highly confidential, and it looks like all the same sub-label names and stuff like that. So what's
Correct.
how do we, why do we need 2 levels of confidential? Like what's the thinking here?
Okay, so if we read the description for confidential all employees first, that says that this is the confidential data that requires protection, which allows all employees full permissions, and then data owners can track and revoke content. Whereas the highly confidential all employees says that it's a highly confidential data that allows all employees view, edit, and reply permission to this content. And again, the data owners can track and revoke content. So it's a very small difference, but it's a difference where, let's say, if that data that is highly confidential was to be released to the public, there's obviously a number of repercussions that will follow that, right? Your brand reputation, your company reputation might suffer. Obviously, your sensitive content is then out there. So it's a very small difference between those labels, but in most of the cases, you're going to need to differentiate what is perceived as confidential versus what is perceived as highly confidential for your business. And obviously with that highly confidential one, that is then going to have a very negative impact on your business if that data was to be shared publicly.
Okay, so it's the degree to which I have a really bad day if that information gets out there. And then the technical limitation that's imposed on top of that is my ability to even change the label, right? So if it's so confidential that I know the public cannot know about this or my competitors cannot know about this, I slap on highly confidential, and it means no one else in the company can change that label. But if it's something where, yeah, it'd be bad if other folk found out about this, but I need some flexibility for people, I could then choose confidential and then they could remove confidential if they ever needed to. That's the technical difference here?
Yeah, and that could be one of the technical differences. Obviously, it's not to say that you have to publish the highly confidential all employees, let's say, to everyone within the organization. Maybe only the, most trusted people would have access to it, like your payroll department or your CEOs and your high executive team or something like that.
Okay, I get you, because I was thinking, like, as we're running through this, I'm thinking there's tons and tons of labels here, but I guess that goes back to the idea of the persona, where, hey, if there's folks that just wouldn't ever need that label, you can hide it from them. Like, hey, if I've got someone that's just responding to help desk tickets all day, why do they need highly confidential? That kind of idea.
Yeah.
100%. Okay, and that would only stop them being able to apply the label rather than read the label. Is that right? So if I give you an example about that, let's say I get someone who I do not let them assign highly confidential as a label because I want to minimize the labels they got, keep it simple for them. But then they receive a highly confidential email that says highly confidential all employees. They're part of all employees. Will they be able to read the content, or do they have to be able to assign the label in order to read the label? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. So the label policy, so the policy in which you publish the labels to be available to the end users within the Microsoft 365 applications, this is going to determine, like, whoever is in the scope of that policy, that's going to determine who will actually be able to apply that label to their content that they create, right? The label permissions for highly confidential, for example. So if you mark that all employees will be able to have the permission of being a co-author of that label, they don't need to have that specific label published to them to be able to consume that content. So it's all down to who is in the scope of the label policy and also who is in the scope of the sensitivity label permissions.
Okay, understood. So the label itself defines kind of the access control list to that, and that's completely separate from who gets the permission to actually assign the label, which is done via the policies. And so this is the baseline, right? And we've just come up with loads of ways where you wouldn't exactly want to follow the baseline, right? You want to tweak it and change it and stuff like that. So where do you go from there, right? What's the kind of, how do I take this stuff I've just learned and kind of think, okay, well, I need to change this, change that. What's the right course of action here?
Sure. So the way we kind of do it at ThreatScope and like I do it with all the different customers that I work with, is that we engage in a workshop where we actually decide and agree the label taxonomy that will fit their organization and their organizational needs. So we might, for example, take what we are seeing on the screen now and revamp it a little bit to better kind of fit their requirements, right? So you could do it just, let's say, when you are sharing your screen with the customer, you can do it just on a piece of paper. But I suppose for the demonstration purposes, this is what I would come up with, right? So let's say I just create a little table in Microsoft Word, and then I just kind of modified some of the labels to better fit the organization that I work with, right?
Gotcha.
So, for example, that internal exception, maybe that might not translate quite well to my end users. Maybe I just want to change the wording of that. So how about, let's say, we change it to anyone, right? I think that it would be better understood by my end users, where they could actually see that there's a confidential all employees versus confidential anyone. Or maybe you could be working with a different organization that would have slightly different idea to that as well, where, for example, they might just differentiate that to confidential internal versus confidential external.
Okay. So if we
the name,
let's say I've got my company, right? So we'll run through this and we'll create this imaginary company.
The name,
we'll call it Contoso.
The name.
Obviously, that's a completely original company name that I haven't heard anyone else in the Microsoft world use before. So I'm the data security architect for Contoso or something like that. And I'm looking at this baseline labels. Number one, I agree with you about external exception. So let's change that to anyone, because internal exception to me, it's just, I mean, I don't really even understand that terminology, never mind everyone else in the business. And I go back to that point we spoke about earlier with public in general. If, let's assume my company doesn't typically work with public-facing information, right? Let's say everything we do is kind of business to business. We're not a consumer company. We don't deal with individuals from the public. We deal with other businesses. Do you need that public label at all? Can you simplify it in just a general? What's your approach there?
Absolutely, because they're quite similar in the configuration details that kind of follow that name, right? Which means that neither of them apply encryption, neither of them apply any content marking. So yeah, if you want to kind of simplify that label taxonomy for your end users, sure. How about, let's say, for example, if I was to suggest that maybe you're going to need a label called personal, how would you feel about that? Let's say, would there be any use case for your end users within your company where the end users would feel the need that some of the information that they receive, whether these are emails, whether these are, I don't know, appraisal forms or whatever, is this stuff going to be personal to them? Do you want to classify it differently, or do you maybe want to for that content to kind of fall under the category of general or confidential?
Good question. So when we say when we say personal, you're talking about information that is kind of related to me individually as an employee of the company that I wouldn't want anyone else to know about. That's what you're saying, right? So you mentioned things, so kind of like my HR files, my payroll files, my annual review, stuff like that. Based on what you've told me, does that just fall under the specific people one? Do you maybe have confidential personal, or where would you typically place something like that?
You see, it all kind of depends. If you don't really see any difference between the idea behind personal versus, let's say, confidential specific people or highly confidential specific people, if you really want to simplify that label taxonomy, maybe there's no need to have a personal one, let's say, to replace the public one over here, right?
Okay. Let's say, for example, I'm emailing my boss and I get something secret I need to tell him and I don't want anyone else to know about it. To me, I would probably just slap confidential on it. But again, this probably goes to your point of it all depends on, kind of depends how people in your company think, right? Like what's intuitive to them. And how do you figure that out, right? You just got to test stuff, I guess, roll it out and see if folk adopt it.
Yeah, but also some companies might be within that specific industry where maybe there's a regulation that does require them to have a specific label just for the personal content with that specific or similar name as well. You know, we work with different industries different types of customers as well, depending on the size of the business and the level of their maturity. Maybe there's a specific requirement from, I don't know,
Wow.
GDPR point of view or whatever, that they
I
actually
get
need
it.
that as well.
So,
The name,
okay, so following that train of thought then, let's say
the name,
I start using this personal tag and, you know, all my payslips come through and they get tagged as personal and my HR records and all that kind of stuff. That's a specific piece of metadata against those emails and those files.
the name, the name, the name, the
Are
name.
there then implications on things you can do with like retention? Like, because I know it's a different type of label than a retention label, but let's say I leave a company and then 3 years later, does it make it easier for them to figure out how much
The name, the name.
personal data we're holding for people who left the business 3 years ago? But then I guess, how would you tell which person it was? I don't know. I don't know if but you see my kind of train of thought there.
Yeah. I agree. So again, if you just have a one personal label, that will definitely help you determine how much of that data still kind of resides within your cloud repositories, or how much that data, is still being shared, and you can then apply a retention label for that specific content as well, where, I don't know, that could be deleted after 3-5 years after a user's departure as well. So maybe you do fall under that category where you do need to delete employee or patient or whatever data, or a client data. So you would benefit from having some additional settings on top of that as well. If it's just personal to do with your employees' data, there are various different things that you can actually do within that space.
So could, for example, you have a child label called confidential me only or something like that, where, because all employees don't want that to apply in this case. Specific people kind of want it to apply, but I may not, right? Me only, I don't know. Geez, you really get into the realm of, this can get quite complicated in a hurry, right? I guess is the kind of conclusion I'm making here.
Absolutely.
If
me only,
yeah,
I don't really see that working out.
Yeah, because by nature you're going to be sharing it with people, right? Like,
correct. And also it would be very hard to set it up at scale. Yeah. Because obviously you're going to need a me only label, then I'm going to need me only label as well. So where do you stop?
The number of labels would be equal to the number of people in your company, right? Okay. If I didn't go down the route of having this personal label, what risks do I face? What's the...
Gosh.
We mentioned one idea that it could be used to delete personal data after 3 years or whatever.
Good question, and it's a really tough question as well.
Yeah.
The level of repercussions or level of challenges that you're going to face when you don't have that label in place, that's going to, well, our favorite kind of phrase in the cybersecurity world, right? Where we just say it depends. Yeah. It's going to depend on your organization, your maturity level, the type of industry that you are within. Do you need to abide by any specific regulations? These are the questions that you need to be asking yourself when you do look at the label taxonomy and what labels you should be setting up.
Okay, so let's if we take the label that's called public and we rename it to personal, and I just want to be crystal clear here, you could, for example, then just have a company-wide policy that you communicate to everyone, right? And you say, hey, if you tag stuff with this, it's going to be protected, but it will be deleted automatically after 3 years or something like that, right? Is that the kind of thing that would be reasonable and that you kind of see some customers doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And also you could have like a retention policy at the back of that as well, that after a user's departure, let's say after a period of 3, 5, 10 years or whatever, that data is going to be deleted, not maybe from the moment that stuff like that is going to be created or labeled or whatever.
Okay. How does it... Geez, we're really getting into the weeds here. How does that work insofar as, does it basically say where the owner is this person and the label is personal, apply this policy and delete it? How does that actually work? How does it know which person has left and then delete it?
So you can actually connect it with the right level of license, let's say, to the data from within a CRM system. That's just one of the examples. So that based on the departure date or the date when someone resigns, you can kind of map it to a specific user. Okay,
so I got my HR system, like Workday or something, and it says Rue Campbell resigned on the 1st of January 2020, and therefore on the 1st of January 2023, we're just going to delete anything he created that had that personal label attached to it, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay.
You can have a specific adaptive protection mechanism as well. You can use Power Automate or any kind of type of an automation or whatever. You can use APIs as well for that purpose. So we're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty of
we really are.
labeling
We really
here.
are. And I'll tell you what, it makes me a little bit nervous when we start talking about deleting stuff, right? You know what I mean? But that's the case, right? So you want to hoard all that data because what if I need it, right? But I guess to your point, it all boils down to if you get specifically regulations you want to tier 2 and frameworks and all that. Okay, well, I'll tell
and
you
again, we're kind of getting outside of the scope of labeling itself, but before you delete stuff, you also have an option for content go on for a disposition review. So before it actually gets deleted, someone can jump in and review whether that's actually can be deleted or whether you should retain it as well. So there are different kind of security measures or preventative measures that will make sure that you're not actually deleting stuff when it's still needed.
And just to be clear, even though we're talking about sensitivity labels here, what actually does that is the retention label / policy. It's just that it can use the sensitivity label as a kind of automatic identifier. That's
correct.
That's the distinction, right? Okay.
So we kind of go back to that defense in depth approach where labels are always going to be kind of the fundamental part of everything else that will follow Microsoft information protection. So you really want to make sure that you get your label taxonomy right from the get-go, or based on user feedback, you can always go back and refine those labels, but getting those settings or the kind of the hierarchy right will then help you down the road when you actually go to delete some of the data or apply different retention mechanism or different preventative measures of sharing that data externally and internally and so on.
Okay. I tell you what, at Contoso, we're a simple bunch of folks and we don't want to make life too complicated. So I'm going to make an executive decision here. Parent label, personal, let's demolish that. We're just going to have general. So let's get rid of that one. Keep life simple.
The name.
So general, confidential, highly confidential. Okay, so that all sounds about good for Contoso. I guess I do have one. If after you.
Sorry, just in terms of the highly confidential internal exception, would you like to mirror that to what we've got under confidential anyone?
Yes, that's exactly what I was about to say. Let's do that. And also, I've got an idea. I don't know how often you see this in customers. It probably doesn't really matter. Instead of saying like confidential and highly confidential, could you say secret and top secret? Or does it matter? Is there a right or a wrong there? What do you kind of...
Again, there's no right or wrong. There's no one size fits all. It's just whatever is easier for you and your users.
Let's just stick with what we got then. Yeah, let's keep life simple. I got one more idea that I want to bounce off you. So we got all employees, specific people, and we get anyone. Can I also have a label that limits it just to my department? So for example, if I work in the IT department, have confidential or highly confidential label, or maybe both, that's just called, I don't know, IT department? Something like that. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So what I would probably suggest is that how would you differentiate confidential IT department versus highly confidential IT department? So are they both going to be encrypted?
Yes. Yep. So I want to keep it encrypted to the IT department. But good question insofar as I would probably... Would I ever be sending really highly confidential to the IT department? Maybe. I don't know, I guess is the answer. I definitely be sending them confidential stuff. Would you send them highly confidential? Sure, actually. Yeah, you might. So if I give you an example, if I'm thinking out loud here, confidential to the IT department might be something like, hey, here's the budget for next year or something like that, right? And I need everyone to let me know what they want to buy for next year. Highly confidential, maybe something like, oh, hey, we got hacked 3 days ago. Here's what happened. You know what I mean? So it's to your point earlier, it's the degree at which I want damage control over that information, right? So yeah, cool. I think that makes sense.
Makes sense, absolutely.
And is that the kind of IT department, we'll call it, I guess, if that's... And is this kind of thing, when you work with customers, doing this kind of stuff every day, I know you do a lot of this as part of the Purview implementation service at Threatscape. Is this the kind of thing that folks do? Like, is this kind of standard operating procedure? What What's the real life experience here?
Absolutely. I mean, we've worked with so many different organizations, and as I said before, there's no kind of one size fits all. So when we do at the Purview implementation service for our clients, we do always engage in a series of workshops where we talk to the client and then we decide or help decide what that label taxonomy would look like. So we let the customer make that decision. We present like our recommended labels, and then we go from there to then decide, okay, do you want to just go with the standard ones? Do you feel the need for any additional labels that would be specific maybe to your departments or maybe to just the executive team or something like that? So it is something that I kind of see quite commonly, to be honest.
And the follow-up question I got, this is more of a technical implementation or technical possibilities of Purview question. I mentioned IT department because it's where I work, right? In Contoso. Can you do that kind of like dynamically? Like, could you have a child label that was just the department of whoever is using the labels at the time? Or is that the realm of specific people? Because if I think of examples where, organizations could have hundreds, thousands of departments, that would be hundreds of thousands of labels, right? If you wanted to give them that level of granularity. Is that like a type of built-in capability in Purview, or do you have to go down the route of specifying it manually like we've done here?
Good question. So when you are setting up a label, let's say if we go with the IT department, let's say you want that group that will be assigned to the that specific permission to be maybe dynamic, right? So the tricky thing with the supported groups that you can use within the sensitivity labels is that they need to be mail enabled. So as long as you can have a dynamic mail enabled group that you can assign to a specific permission, then again, you can dynamically be applying that or publishing that to your end users. So you can have a dynamic distribution list, for example, which then would be mail enabled and would meet your criteria, where let's say based on a specific attribute assigned to a user, let's say any new person joining the IT department will then automatically be added within the scope of that label or have that label published to them as well.
But the bottom line is it always has to link back to a mail-enabled security group of some kind, or a group that's got an email attached to it. You wouldn't be able to say, for example, just have a child label, name it my department, and then the sensitivity label is smart enough to then limit it to people in your department, because it might not have a mail-enabled group linked to it, right? You always got to have that group in the background if you want to go down this route.
Correct. You would always specify the permission and link them to a specific group.
Okay, cool. All right, so that kind of thrashes out what a label taxonomy might look like. When you're going through stuff like this and you're thinking about label design and anything, are there any questions or things that customers would raise with you that we haven't covered? Like, is this a good starting point, or have we missed anything? What's the kind of next steps there that I need to think about before I start building these labels?
It is definitely a starting point that I would cover with all of our clients. However, there's probably a list of a good few prerequisites that you also need to meet as well, or a question that I would kind of use them as a follow-up after our workshop in terms of what type of applications are the end user using? Are they on the latest version of the application? Do they also use any other features within the Microsoft Purview stack or even the Defender XDR and stuff like that, to kind of help me determine what else are we going to need, what types of integration you would wish to enable on the back of that as well. And I suppose the one thing to mention as well, when you are working with sensitivity labels and you introduce the whole idea of encryption, if you use conditional access within Entra and you've got policies that would enforce multi-factor authentication, once you introduce the idea of encryption, what I would suggest you do is that when you mix, again, MFA with encryption and with conditional access, what sometimes happens is that they don't quite work together really well. So what you may want to do is exclude the Azure Rights Management application from the scope of your conditional access policies that will enforce multi-factor authentication as well. So again, it's not to say that your users are going to run into any specific issues for sure, but just as a preventative measure, this is what you can use. Or alternatively, you can use the tenant integrations where you, for example, accept multi-factor authentication methods from other tenants that you would be working with or collaborating with as well.
But now that you mention it, I do remember this coming up. This is where if I send a file that is labeled to an external recipient,
the name
and MFA is required for all cloud apps, they can't actually satisfy the MFA claim because they haven't registered MFA in my tenant, right? And that's why you want to allow MFA for other tenants as a kind of pass-through rather than register it. Now that you're suitably schooled in the design and architecture of sensitivity labels, make sure you subscribe to us and check out part 2, where Evelina continues to hold my hand through sensitivity label configuration, this time explaining every single setting that matters.